Hi, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on beauty, this beautiful, crisp November afternoon in Indianapolis. And thank you for coming from all across the world. We have a few international guests as well. My name is Alexandra Hudson, and I'm a writer and journalist, and it was my privilege to be a part of curating a rare books and art exhibit at the Harrison Center this past October. And this event today on beauty is part of the programming for this exhibit. And so thrilled to have some incredibly thoughtful and talented women on this panel to have this to be a part of this discussion. And just to give you a little bit of a run of show, we'll have Joanna Taft, who is executive director of the Harrison Center, offer some framing remarks about beauty as a tool of cultural healing and renewal, and their philosophy at the Harrison Center for doing that, actually being on the ground doing that work. And then we will have a free-flowing conversation with our panelists for maybe 45 minutes or so, and then open it up to some questions and maybe wrap up just after 1 p.m. or so. We can see how the conversation goes. And so thank you to all of you for being here. And I'll just introduce our panel very quickly. We have Snyder, who is a very incredibly talented writer and author, and also editor of Comment magazine, a project of Cardis, which is a think tank in Toronto, Canada. We have Angela Brawley, who is an incredibly accomplished businesswoman and co-founder of the Policy Circle, a environment and intellectual community for women to talk about ideas based here in Indianapolis, but it's also spreading like wildfire all across the country. It's a really incredible achievement that the Policy Circle has achieved. And we have Rima, who is the head of Women for Change. That is a women's advocacy group also based here in Indianapolis, and just a wonderful community of strong, opinionated, thoughtful women. And so delighted to have Women for Change as a partner in this conversation. And we have Joanna Taft, who is, of course, as I mentioned, she is going to be offering some framing remarks. She is a cultural entrepreneur in her own right, a force of nature, makes everything that she touches better and more beautiful. So a real authority on the topic at hand that we are talking about today. And I'm so glad to have some opening remarks from her. And we have Alicia Zanoni, who is an artist at the Harrison Center, and who recently, in our exhibit this past October, contributed to our exhibition, was one of the 4 very talented artists we had as we sought to bring ideas of civic renewal and citizenship to life, bring the ideas of these seminal texts and rare books to life through different mediums of art. So we'll actually be showing you one of her pieces of work from the exhibit for her to walk through her vision, her philosophy of beauty, and why it is a powerful tool and how it can be useful to us today. So without further ado, I will turn the mic over to Joanna. Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you, Lexi. I'm excited to be a part of this, to introduce this panel today. I run an art center, and it is clear to me that culture and beauty has always been a part of American life. It's always been part of our civic life through ceremony, architecture, shared history, and public art. So I grew up in DC, and I remember as a child going to see the parades and military concerts and going to the Smithsonian. And through DC's architecture and urban design and pomp and circumstance and public art, basically it was a piece of art. And these symbols, these efforts in DC have traditionally served as powerful symbols that represent our ideals of democracy and bring unity and promote the common good over the individual or tribal interest. So in the last 4 years, and in the pandemic crescendo, it hasn't really felt like we've celebrated together. In fact, some would argue that our civic liturgies and rhythms have been neglected, or have neglected design, and we've felt even more divided. Many of us don't know how to fix national problems. I don't. But we do know, and we should know, that we can start at home, at the neighborhood level, at the local level, to build community and to heal divides. And this is where the Harrison Center has really learned to focus. We focus on our local community. Art is powerful. Art is so powerful, it can actually divide culture, it can alienate. Art is so powerful, it can unify and it can heal. And when you don't understand its power and you use it, it can be like playing with fire. And it can yield some pretty nasty results. So after making our own mistakes, the Harrison Center now uses art to know and love people. And we invite our community to be a part of the same story. So several years ago, we were faced with an especially divisive issue of gentrification. We were partly to blame. Our artists were working in neighborhoods and our artists were creating vitality. Neighborhoods were rebranded, new residents were moving in as urban pioneers. There was a lot of economic investment, but you know what? The long-term neighbors felt like strangers in their own neighborhood. The community felt divided. We wondered what went wrong. We wondered how we could create a different model of revitalization that was equitable and inclusive. But the problem was we had never seen a neighborhood like that before. So we turned to art, we turned to beauty, we turned to theater to help us. We hired 13 theater companies and we took a 3-block blighted section of the community and turned that into our stage. The set designers built 11 temporary buildings and activated the vacant buildings as well. And the actors acted out what we had never seen before, a neighborhood that ought to be, a neighborhood where there was justice and mercy, a neighborhood where everyone was part of the same story. Going forward from that experience, and we did that 4 years ago, we've done it every year since. It's called pre-enactment theater, not a reenactment, but pre-enacting a just and equitable future. But going forward, we learned to change the way we use art. We are now very intentional, understanding the power of art, and we use it not to add vitality, and there's nothing wrong with adding vitality, but we use it to love and to know people. We use it to love and to know our neighborhood stories. And this application of art through pre-enactment theater elevated the story of the neighborhood, elevated the story of the long-term residents, and prevented the neighborhood culture from being erased. And then it also invited the new people, because we do want new people to move into neighborhoods. It invited the new people to join an existing story rather than seeing the neighborhood as a blank slate. This is the power of art to heal and include. We're going to hear more on the subject today with our panelists, and I'm excited to hear more as we wrestle to take steps to reclaim art for healing and unity in this divided time. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. I always love hearing you talk and hearing your story and hearing your passion for what you do. Very inspiring, very grateful to you. And those were perfect sentiments to start off our conversation about your experience on the power of art as a tool of healing or a tool of divisiveness. And on that question of the relationship between the beautiful and cultural healing, I'd like to ask Anne a question. So in traditional, classical philosophy, the true, the good, and the beautiful, these foundational virtues are foundational, and in Platonic theory, they're one and the same, and a misunderstanding of one, like there's no such thing as something that's beautiful but not good. But as we were just talking about, there are examples of things that are beautiful that maybe aren't good, and so I'm curious, Anne, if you want to tease out the relationship between the aesthetic and the ethical. What is the relationship between truth, goodness, and beauty, and what implications does that have for our culture and how we think about the role of beauty in society?
Sure. Thank you, Lexi, and thank you to Joanna and the Harrison Center for convening this. I live in DC, and the topic of beauty is like a perennially very refreshing topic to me. It feels like lemonade every time. So I'm probably not going to do your question justice, Lexi, although I love the question. I think there's just something about beauty that isn't really capturable in words. Or at least not didactic explanations the way we typically find ourselves talking about truth or the good. And not to say actually that conversations about what is true and what is good shouldn't be enhanced if our way, or could, would be enhanced if I think if our way into those subjects was through beauty, which to me is a language sort of best expressed in metaphor or parables or music or art or landscape or, a gorgeous act of sacrifice. A community of conscience marching in unison, pre-enacting perhaps. But just given that words are all that I have in this medium on a panel here, I'll just say a few things as I've thought about it and studied it, and I guess in my own little way tried to encourage beauty as a way of introducing people to longings and sort of reordering desires. There's a painter that some of you may know living today, originally Japanese, now lives in the US, named Mako Fujimura, and he likes to say that God the artist communicates to us first before God the lecturer. And, I think, many of our most celebrated philosophers and moral thinkers throughout the ages, interestingly, often wrote books on aesthetics as sort of their gateway to then writing about the moral life. I'm thinking about Edmund Burke, one of his first works was titled A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas and the Sublime and the Beautiful, which he wrote when he was not even 19 years old. Obviously, Kant's aesthetics and notion of taste, which later I think Hannah Arendt developed to promote sort of a distinctively aesthetic form of politics. And just, I think in general, there's this sort of experience that's very timeless and human of glimpsing the beautiful just exalts us. It sort of sends us to understand something, whether it be of divine order, if you believe in a divine creational order, just like this Platonic sense of how things are meant to be. And it travels through us. I think it comes to us often not through the cognitive. In my own case, like I wound up in the profession of writing and editing. But honestly, before either of those things, I'm personally probably first and foremost a musician. I was a serious pianist for a long time and flirted with following that path professionally. And to this day, both in my writing and editing, I just think musically first. I interpret musically. I make judgments often based on sort of musical laws and intuitions. In many ways, my sort of sense of other people, and if I have any kind of emotional intelligence, that's informed by jazz and, even convictions or intuitions I have around justice and who I really need to defend or protect or honor, or my attraction to mercy, or when I need courage in a particular, say, moral dilemma or professional height to like stand up for something and suffer the cost. I'll listen to, this may make people laugh, it's a little corny, but I'll listen to, Simon and Garfunkel's Sound of Silence, or Handel's Messiah, or pretty much anything Ennio Morricone ever wrote, or, rhythms from Senegalese monks, flutes in the Andes. So to me, like the sort of aesthetic is in ways I can't quite describe, like very morally directive. And obviously I've had to read books and I've had to be raised by parents, informed by schools and so on, to have content to those moral intuitions. But there's something about this sort of catapulting aesthetic power of being moved beyond even what your own head can understand. And as the last thing I'll say is I think there's something about beauty that is just inherently anti-utilitarian. It does not speak in a mechanistic language. It's sort of anti-efficiency. And it is oriented towards abundance. At the same time, I think its deepest manifestations often seem to be connected to sacrifice. So I'll stop there. There's more I could say, and we could have a debate around whether beauty is objective or not. And I would love to talk about that with these ladies, but this is my opening little volley. Thanks, Lexi.
Thank you, Anne. That was exceptional. I love what you said, that beauty really does transcend the intellect and go straight to the soul, straight to the human, the human heart. And that is why art has had such a powerful role in human history. For most of human history, we haven't been able to read and write. We have been pre-literate. And beauty and art is how a culture communicated values and adorned and made beautiful that which it idealized. which is why religious art of all backgrounds is so magnificent, because that's people's heart and soul that they're depicting and adorning and making front and center in their culture. And it ties into what Joanna said about why our monuments are so beautiful. Like, they're meant to inspire awe and elevate us and make us reflect on our ideals. I'd like to get a practitioner's perspective. We have Alicia Zanoni, an artist at the Harrison Center, who is part of our panel conversation today. And Alicia was a part of our Rare Books and Art exhibit. She was one of the artists, one of the 4 incredibly talented artists that we had bring to life the themes of rare works of political theory, political philosophy, human liberty, and human dignity. And I'd like to bring in Alicia and get her thoughts on this role, the role of beauty and art in a society, kind of the broad question of our panel, but also about the relationship between the aesthetic and the intellectual life. Alicia, I'd love to hear more about the books that you had reflected on and brought to life through the works of art that you worked on. And I actually have one of them. I have the one on Rousseau, Alicia, if you want to talk about that, ready to share the group. So I will, Alicia, your thoughts on the relationship between the intellectual and the aesthetic, and also the power of art in society.
Well, yeah, I can share a few thoughts on the Rousseau piece.
Okay, I will bring it up. Can everyone see that? Great.
So Rousseau did a lot of writing that influenced the French Revolution, actually. And so this piece, in a visual way, I wanted it to look like a rupture to the landscape. So you see the bright spot of light, the vibrancy coming through. And so I wanted to communicate what I felt conceptually through his work, which was this boldness to say these new ideas, to push back against the culture of his time. And I think in color, I think in contrasting color, warmth and cool colors working together to create this sense of electricity that we sense visually. And for me as the painter, it evokes this emotional response, like there's something happening in this, this interplay in the color that really seemed to reflect what I thought he was doing in his writing. And I thought a lot about beauty as an artist. I think I had a very simplistic idea of it when I first began to paint. I think I thought of beauty as a sunset, as, the very stereotypical things that we think of, like grand things, like an amazing cloud that's rimmed with gold light, or a field of flowers. And I was so surprised when I began to paint downtown in Indy when I first began as an intern here. And I was surrounded by concrete buildings, concrete roads, and I grew up in the Smoky Mountains. So it was just this contrast in terms of what I'm used to seeing and feeling really inspired by, the mountains, the layers of atmosphere. And here I was surrounded by all this concrete. And I was so amazed to look at the colors and the shadows on this concrete and notice how many variations of purple and blue and orange, and to look at the way the shadows played against the buildings. And I was so surprised at how beautiful these little details were. And how I even just thought, and I was talking to Joanna about this the other day, just the crunch of the leaves under my feet. I was thinking about that and just how beautiful that is. And I was just amazed at the nuance of beauty, and was read this quote not too long ago by Piero Ferrucci. I don't know if I'm saying his name correctly, but he wrote a book called Beauty and the Soul. And his quote that struck me was, "Beauty is the affirmation of life." And really what I was starting to sense a couple years ago painting in this concrete environment was that there was still life and reminders of life everywhere around me. The fact that the sun was rising and setting every day, and that the shadows across the buildings were reminding me of that, and that was why they were beautiful, just really struck me. And so beauty, I don't think, has to be anything grand. It can be the smallest reminder that we are alive and that we have another day to breathe and to be, and that is such an incredible blessing. And so as a painter, I'm just struck by all these little details and so inspired by things that I think before I would have thought is totally insignificant.
Thank you, Alicia. That was wonderful. Can you say a little bit more about what inspires you to create beauty as a practitioner, as a full-time artist?
Oh my goodness. So when I paint, I'm a landscape painter, and sometimes I paint from photos. I do some commission work where if someone goes on a vacation, they take a photo, they'll send it my way, and I'll make a painting for them. And I love doing work like that. But in addition to that, I paint scenes that just come from my mind and from my imagination. Sometimes I close my eyes when I paint, and I just let the brush do something on the canvas that feels like it's truly coming from my soul. And so when I am painting, I feel this difference between when I'm painting and it's tight and it's controlled and it's a little bit obsessive. I tend to be a little bit obsessive in general. And so I think sometimes I can get really caught up in that in my paintings versus when I'm just letting it flow and it becomes this just like embodied experience, an experience that transcends. I know this sounds so heavy and I'm starting to sound like the kooky artist, but it just transcends what I can find words for. It's just a feeling. And so I think about our inner landscape as people, how we can describe our inner selves as weather, like stormy weather, sunny weather, cloudy weather, windy weather. I mean, I think when we look at the sky, we can sense in ourselves what that's like. And so as a landscape painter, I usually end up connecting whatever my internal landscape is in the moment with what I'm painting. And I think it's really important for artists to paint or to create because it gives an invitation to the viewer to do the same thing, to look deeper, to reflect, to connect in a way that, Anne, I believe you said, it's not utilitarian. It's just a moment to be and to feel deeply, and like Ferrucci said, to be affirmed of life.
Beauty is rarely practical. Sometimes it can be, but I appreciate what you said, Alicia, how you adorn nature. You paint landscapes. That's what inspires you. That's what you enjoy bringing to life or depicting or immortalizing through your work. But there's something universal about that. We see across time and place poems and paintings of mountains and the sunset and people looking at nature, looking up at a tree and being awed by it and just inspired by it. And it really puts into perspective, our petty human problems and just how small we are and the vastness of eternity and the vastness of nature. And I'd like to turn to Rima and get her thoughts on what do you think is universal? What makes that a universal sense, that sense of awe, that sense of wonder? And what does that say about what it means to be human, Rima?
Thank you. I think what's unique about the word beauty is that I think it brings out different emotions and thoughts in different people. And so as I'm listening to the other panelists, I am reminded how differently I view beauty and what that means to me. And so my perspective is probably very different than the others that have spoken before me. And I think that's part of it, is that each one of us has a different outlook on this word and a different take on this word. And it's very much of who you are and what you do and what your passions are is how you would interpret this word. So being an activist and an advocate, I look at beauty in terms of cultural and societal beauty standards. That's the first thought that comes to my mind. And I think that standards are kind of subjective, right? Like a mile is a mile, a kilometer is a kilometer, and an apple weighs the same as another apple. But the perception of beauty is really based on your geography and your culture and where you are. I'm a born and raised native Hoosier. And I remember growing up here in central Indiana and really sticking out. And really, I looked very different than the children that I went to school with. And I remember very vividly people making comments about my skin color and about my hair color and how my skin was an ugly brown. And that's really, again, based on geography because of how different I was. I remember being in 7th grade and my science teacher had me wash my hands over 8 times because he had never seen henna before. And he thought I drew on myself and would not allow me to participate in the science experiment, which would I've gladly given up anyway, because he thought I drew on myself. But that is because of a lack of cultural understanding. And, you know, it was many years ago. And so as we've evolved, but I think that societal beauty is an aspirational endeavor rather than an intrinsic gift. From my experience in living in various parts of the world, when it comes to beauty standards, I think the only common theme is an aversion to the physical traits that are dominant in a region or culture. For example, here in the United States, we had an explosion of tanning salons and bronzers and lip fillers. Whereas if you go into some parts, and I'm broadly stereotyping right now, but if you go into some parts in South Asia and across Africa, you will find face whitening creams on the shelves. This is in part because of the dominant culture, but in part, and you know, thanks to colonization by the British Empire. I remember having this conversation with my mother-in-law, where she told me that my family my parents immigrated from Pakistan to Carmel. I don't know how they chose Carmel, and maybe they like rolled a dice or did like a dart throwing contest and we landed here. But my mother-in-law has told me that there would be poetry about an art in Pakistan and in India and the Southeast Asia, like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, of people with very thin lips and very thin noses. But that's not the common physical trait of people of that region. But if you think back, that would be more common for the people that had colonized the area, which is the British. And so while they had treated people from that area as second-class citizens, and there was this whole culture of you know, a first-class citizen and the second-class citizen, they had made this idea of beauty to fit what they look like. And I remember growing up and being in Indiana, your lips get really chapped, and I would chew on my lips because they were so chapped instead of putting chapstick on, as I should have. And people would say, no, your lips are going to get very big, and you know, you have to have the thin ones. But now, joke's on them. So I think it's very interesting, and again, and I know I think my perspective is very different again than others, but this term beauty brings out different emotions, different feelings. It brings things from your past. It brings out questions from when you were in middle school and people ask you, is your hair naturally black? Because they'd never seen someone that wasn't African American with black hair. And this little girl actually asked me if I dyed my hair black because she didn't understand. She thought I should have been a brunette. And it just brings on, I think it's interesting how we take that standard and apply it to art and apply it to poetry and apply it to music and all these things that really again, influence our culture and who we are. And it seems almost as a vicious cycle.
Rima, thank you for sharing that, that sadness and that. Thank you for being vulnerable and honest in this conversation. It brings up two things in my mind. One is this timeless human tendency to want what we can't have. That was really interesting how you talked about what a society thinks is beautiful is what most of the society doesn't have. I think that is, I've heard that and read that elsewhere. That's a really interesting insight. And related to that is how what we find beautiful, it can either be something that affirms our pre-existing beliefs, or it can be an exercise in empathy. And what I mean by that is, you shared the horrible experience of being held to someone else's standards of what was normal and what was beautiful growing up in your environment, but how it can be an exercise of empathy to consider other people's perspective, other people's experiences as well, to say, to incorporate other visions of beauty and into our vision of and societal standards and ideals. Just thinking about ways that we can use this conversation here and the concept of beauty to foster empathy and foster just compassion for our fellow man that we so direly need right now. Thank you. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I will also say, on the flip side, I have hazel colored eyes, and in Pakistan, that's not. A lot of people will have darker brown colored eyes, and about 10 years ago, I actually I had a virus and lost my eyesight in my left eye, and so I'm actually legally blind in my left eye. But I think in terms of beauty, I will have people say to me, "Oh, you have pretty eyes," and my answer is always the same, that my left eye is kind of like a bowl of potpourri that kind of sits out there, but really loses that sense of function, right? It looks kind of pretty, but it doesn't smell good anymore. And I'll joke about it, and they'll say, "Well, it's out of order now." And they'll say, "Well, I'd rather have hazel colored eyes or green colored eyes than brown eyes." And that's a societal. And so what is more beautiful is the ability to see from two eyes and the ability to function, or to have something that is not within those societal norms that sets you off and makes you more unique. And I think that is, again, a function of culture, of geography, and how we use that within art, music, and what we aspire to be, film. So it goes both ways.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rima. You mentioned, and it's come up a few times in the conversation, the different manifestations of art and beauty, whether it is film, whether it is a sunset and depicting that in a landscape painting, whether it's fashion. There are so many different manifestations of creativity and beauty and one thing that I'm really passionate about is reminding people that we are all creators and we're all have this creative capacity. It's part of what it means to be human, to identify what we find beautiful, to curate our taste, to cultivate what it is, our craft, and to hone that and bring forth the what we have best to offer the world in some sort of creative capacity. And there's one book that I return to time and time again. I'm a writer, and that's my art, that's my craft, and it's a book by another writer called Stephen Pressfield called The War of Art. And if you haven't heard of this book, it's a really fun one for someone who is creative or aspires to be, and it identifies kind of the inner struggle that many of us have from that prevents us from bringing forth this higher and best part of ourselves. We make excuses. And he identifies it as resistance. Just these many things. We're tired, or there are other things going on that bring us down and don't allow us to bring forth this higher and best part of ourselves. So it's a really wonderful, very short book. I call it like a personal trainer for the soul, because it just reminds us that we all have this capacity to be creative and bring forth the best part of our self and our soul and our humanity to bear on the world, and that not doing that is a sad thing. And but that relates to something I wanted to ask Angela about. The Policy Circle, this great women's group, an intellectual group founded here in Indianapolis, but is now all across the country. They just put out a brief on the creative economy, and in which they've summarized kind of the literature and the contributions to our GDP about people who bring their craft to bear and the economic implications of that. So this is how people can be very successful in the marketplace of both ideas and art and just our modern economy. And so, we've talked a little bit about how beauty is ineffable. It's hard to define, hard to put into words. It transcends the intellect. But yet here's a really practical way in which beauty, there's a market for it, a big market. So I'd like to invite Angela to talk a little bit about some really interesting findings from the Policy Circle paper on the creative economy.
Thank you, Lexi. I so appreciate being invited to be here today. And before I get started, I have to say, Alicia, your art is stunning. That painting is just amazing. And I was looking at it as if it could have been painted on the top of a cathedral. The ceiling of a cathedral is really very beautiful. And it's just a reminder of what art does, which is evoke this reaction that we all have to beauty. And you're amazingly talented. And so I'm so honored to be part of this. As Lexi said, the Policy Circle is a network of women who get together in really small groups, actually across the country, and we're in several other countries now. We have about over 350 circles across the country in 42 different states of women who come together to get more informed about policy ideas, to have conversation around policy, and to get more involved in their communities. And really, civic engagement is a real critical component of that. And the way that we do that we facilitate these conversations, is for women to read a brief in advance of coming together in this group. And then when they get together, they have a respectfully facilitated by themselves, really not, as a conversation. And the value we really believe is in the conversation. Women get more informed about an issue, and they get more involved in their community as a result of that. And as Lexi said, so one of the examples of that is a brief on the creative economy, because art and beauty are so important in our society, and it plays a variety of different roles. It impacts how we communicate, it impacts what we desire to see, and all of that has the effect of creating an economy. And so in our brief, you'll read that economists have really defined that over time as all the economic impact of all of these art and beauty activities, whether it's painting or public art or writing, or all the different ways in which we encounter art. And that is a huge impact on the economy overall. One of the economists that we talk about says it's over 6% of the global GDP is somehow related to art. So what does that mean, and how do we fit into it? And in this post-COVID world, how much has art been impacted by the pandemic around the world, and how long we all watched as different institutions and organizations had to close their doors, whether they were artistic or otherwise. So it's an important thing for us to think about. We also think about how the role in our public life of art, how it attracts people to certain communities, what it means. And Joanna talked about it earlier, how a neighborhood can relate to the art that it has. So we're going to include a link to the brief of the creative economy in the chat. And so everyone can, go learn about the policy circle, but then also read the brief and think about how art fits into the broader question of our society, our communities individually, and then even globally, how it's really created an economy that facilitates the ability for artists like Alicia to make it her life's endeavor. So thanks, Lexi.
Thank you, Angela. So 6% of our global economy, that's incredible. I'm not surprised. And if anything, I think it's probably higher than that if you incorporate things like cosmetics and fashion and even just travel and leisure. Like there's a component of, selling an experience and a beautiful experience or memory as well. So that's wonderful and really fascinating. So at this point, I want to introduce some of the ideas from our participants. If anyone has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box if you'd like to hear more from any one of the panelists. Some really thoughtful, really insightful things. Women on this panel and things have been already said, so really grateful to the conversation so far, but we can keep, otherwise while we wait for some questions, we can keep the conversation going unless someone, if any panelists want to respond to anything else anyone has said, I want to invite that as well. There's another book that I really love on beauty. It's called Survival of the Prettiest, and it gets to some of these questions that Rima brought up. It's by a Harvard evolutionary biologist that looks at beauty and what we find beautiful from an evolutionary perspective, and it really does get to some of these ideas about what we find beautiful across time and place, because what we find beautiful is intended to help us, procreate as a species. And it's interesting, Rima, how you said that we want what we can't have as a culture, and what's seen as beautiful tends to be a little bit generic, and what's seen as like a little bit exceptionally beautiful, like exaggerated in some way, is what people find exceptionally beautiful, like Angelina Jolie's lips or bone structure, things like that. Just how kind of average is pretty, but like to be exceptionally beautiful is beyond that. But
I had a thought about that, Lexi, just to add. So I think it is an important distinction to me to make between pretty and beautiful, because we've all had this experience, I'm sure, where we meet someone we think is physically beautiful and maybe get to know them more and then have a different opinion of them, and they somehow don't seem as beautiful. I heard a story recently too of someone who had a loved one drown in a lake, and it was a lake that they had gone to with their family for years, and they loved it. It was one of the most beautiful places on this earth to them. And then after that tragic event, they remember looking out at the lake and just thinking, this is the most horrible scene to them. And it lost all its physical beauty because of the association they had with it. So we've talked a little bit about that connection, the intellectual connection with the physical, the visual. And I think that's so important. I think about that as an artist because I think pretty art is, I have nothing against pretty art that has, the colors that we all might be drawn to for a sunset or for a sky, but I do think there is something deeper I often try to think about as an artist, to see beauty in things that are not pretty, and to see the importance of all aspects of life, like in our relationships. The moments that aren't as pretty are sometimes the moments that bring us the closest together, and it turns into something beautiful through conflict, through hard honesty. And so it's not always easy and pretty, but I think it's deeply beautiful. So I think about that a lot in my art.
I love that, Alicia, how what is beautiful is not always pretty, and even how the relationship between suffering and beauty and creativity, how the tortured artist is a stereotype, but it's true that moments of great suffering and vulnerability and brokenness can create some of the most honest, beautiful just human pieces of art, whether it's literature or a painting or a sculpture. So I love that. So we have some questions from our participants. How do communities in Indiana or beyond Indiana embrace art as a way to connect, learn, and thrive? So open to the panelists, thoughts on ways that Indiana or specifically or other communities, how they either, how they can or how they are acting using art as a way to connect, learn, and thrive.
So this past year, Women for Change, we worked with 75 organizations to bring the Clothesline Project to Indiana. This was a project that was, the artist, her name is Monica Mayer, and she's from New York, I'm saying New York City, she's from Mexico City, and she started this project in the 70s where she had these postcards that she strung on a clothesline to bring awareness around sexual assault and violence. And so we brought that project to Indiana, and it was the first time that I've seen the intersection between advocacy, policy, and art. I'm not saying it may not have been done before, it's just the first time I saw it, to bring awareness on an issue. And I think, you know, whereas we spend so much time talking about policy and statistics, but on March 5th, to see some of the 1,600 postcards that we had collected from all 92 counties displayed in the State House, from people that had either experienced this or knew of someone, wanted the passage of this certain piece of legislation that we were working on, was a really great way, served as a catalyst for change. It brought conversations, it brought that visual effect, and it also, around that subject, it's hard for people to talk about. So it's also very therapeutic to show that you are not alone, that there are others that have experienced this, that you may not have had a chance to speak to a professional about what you went through, but you can remain anonymous. You don't have to tell anybody, but to pour out your feelings onto that paper was very therapeutic for people. And it was a great way for us to bring awareness to this issue and bring communities together. I think sometimes when we talk about policy and issues, we look at it from a rural issue or an urban issue, or you know, and box it in this way. But to see this Clothesline Project from all 92 counties, we know that it's not a rural issue or an urban issue, or with one group of people or with the other group of people, or even that people from a certain political affiliation. It goes beyond that, and something that we can all get together and behind. So that's one example that comes to my mind.
Lexi, I'd like to add another. The Policy Circle had a celebration of the suffrage movement and the role that women in Indiana played. And what we did is we centered it around a commission of art that the Indiana Historical Society has on display that reflects the all of the different women and the activities that were occurring 100 years ago in Indiana. It was exciting to see and learn more about the suffrage movement in Indiana, and to depict in the art the diversity of women in Indiana that participated in the suffrage movement, and to celebrate their effort and to remind ourselves of the importance of the role of art in the community and in what we've learned and how we act. So I encourage you guys, if you haven't seen it, at the Indiana Historical Society, and it was going to become part of the traveling exhibit that focused and celebrated suffrage in Indiana.
Thank you, Angela. Yeah, talk about tying in what both Rima and Angela said, talk about art and beauty as a way, coming from a place of hurt and brokenness. Protest art and activism art is an incredibly powerful subgenre of this conversation. And that gets to another question we have from one of our participants here. One thing I like about the exhibit is the attempt to place social justice movements such as civil rights and women's suffrage in the context of our history. And the conversation of a greater American identity rather than intention of it. And one of my concerns with temporary activism is that it often presents itself as resisting or overturning the American ideal rather than renewing it. We'd love to hear thoughts on people who are part of the exhibit or not. What's the role of art in renewing an American vision of citizenship and identity, as opposed to being used as a tool to undermine it? Where the topic of our conversation here today is how can beauty be used as a tool of cultural healing? So I think that's a really apropos question. So maybe Alicia, who was part of the conversation, maybe Anne, who I know has a passion and a art collection of her own in this genre. Welcome, open to the panelists.
One thing I realized as I was preparing for this show, reading the different works and thinking about it, is the theme that I saw throughout the works was courage. That really spoke to me. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote an address to the legislature of New York, really urging the legislature to give women the equal right to vote, to recognize women's right to vote. And she stepped out in courage to do that. And these are themes that are just as applicable to us today as they were to the readers of their time. And so I think for me, painting making these paintings was a reminder of courage, and just really challenged me to think about how that can play out in my day-to-day.
Thank you, Alicia. I was just Googling, I'm going to put in the chat, Alicia did an incredible portrait of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Oh, it's not, oh, it was right behind you. Last one.
Yep, new show now.
But I will say, I'll put that in the text over and can see that. It's incredible that she's she's a landscape artist and not a portraiture, because it's just such a stunning portrait of this incredibly important member of our history. Any other things to add from other panelists? Please do. Go ahead, Rima.
I really don't mean to take up all the space and realize that I'm doing that, so I apologize. But I also think that we have to be very honest, which is very difficult sometimes, about our history. And I think that when we look at American ideals, we have to be very honest about recognizing and really recognizing individuals for the tremendous contributions that they've made to our country and to our democracy, but also realizing that individuals have faults and that there have been ideas that have been problematic, to say. And so as we do commemorate the 19th Amendment and recognize the suffragettes for the tremendous gains that they made, especially this year, advocating through a pandemic. It's ironic that we're 100 years later in the same place, and I cannot imagine how they would have done that. But we also have to recognize the fact that it wasn't for another about 55 years with the 1965 Voter Rights Act that gave all people the right to vote. And so I think when we're looking at social justice and when we're looking at art and beauty, we have to really be honest with ourselves about what that looks like, so that history doesn't repeat itself, so that we're recognizing them for their contributions to our nation, to our state, while we are recognizing all the hard work that they've put in and how they've done this through such challenging times without the technology that we have today. I mean, for some of us, we're zoomed out, but can you imagine trying to advocate through a pandemic without Zoom? It would have been a lot more difficult, but also recognizing the fact that it was not perfect and that there were faults and that there were trouble. And so I just wanted to share that.
Yes, thank you, Rima. Absolutely. I mean, the role of art in history is inextricable. You can't undo them, because it is how across time and place countries have understood who they are and idealized their values. This is it could be, you know, an epic poem like Homer's Odyssey, which gave this vision of what it meant to be Greek, or it could be Wagner's operas or Verdi's operas that helped Germans and Italians understand what it meant to be German or Italian. For all the reasons we've discussed, art has this powerful ability to encapsulate ideals and inspire us. And in our own moment, as we look at our past and have a growing awareness of racial injustice in our country, I love the line of Samuel Huntington, a political theorist, that it says, you know, some people say America is a lie, but that's not true. The fact is, America is a disappointment, and it can only be a disappointment if it's a hope, because it is a hope. And I think, like, putting our history in context, that it has been this progress of this historical progress of increasingly aspiring to realize a vision of perfect human equality that we may never fully realize this side of paradise. But that doesn't mean that in fact, I think it means all the more that we have opportunities to have conversations like this and adorn and bring to life these ideals of human equality and human dignity and the irreducible worth of every person and our common humanity. That makes it all the more important that we do that. So I love your sentiments, Rima. Thank you so much. I want to ask one more question and give every panelist the chance to answer. So, unfortunately, COVID-19 cases are rising across the country. They're especially bad here in Indianapolis. So it looks like we have a little bit more time ahead of us of social isolation, relative lockdown and distancing. And so what are some ways that despite this part of this unfortunate aspect of the foreseeable future, what are some ways that we can make our more beautiful, make our everyday more beautiful? And I'll to give you a moment to think about that, I'll tell you one way that we've done that. I bought a cookbook. It's a history of Mediterranean cuisine, and it contextualizes some very popular dishes with the history of its development. And I love one line from this cookbook that where it says, you know, there's a difference between cooking, like just raw preparing food, and cuisine, which is enjoying food and making it beautiful, making it a multi-sensory and engaging experience. And so because we're at home so much, we have more time to cook, and making our meals just something to look forward to, and making them an artistic experience, but the creative experience, the enjoying of a beautiful experience as well. So that's one thing that my husband and I are doing. Any thoughts from our panelists?
Well, right now, I think anxiety is on the rise. And one thing I've learned in my experience with anxiety is that it helps to just ground ourselves and practice just being present, mindfulness, and engaging the senses. And so I have an essential oil diffuser, and I love to put essential oils in it, and just remember the smells that I'm experiencing in that moment, walking and thinking about the sounds beneath my feet. Joanna, Taft, and I were just talking about how meaningful those little moments have been for us lately, of just walking and hearing the leaves crunching under our feet, and how little things like that just give us a spark of joy. And so I think just being extra in tune to our senses that's been really helpful to me.
Wonderful. Angela or Rima or Anne, any thoughts on how to make our everyday more beautiful?
Lexi, I think you have to unmute Angela. I think that's what she's saying.
Thank you. Okay, I was going to say, isn't that a reflection? I mean, you're cooking and just understanding the value of every day. I do think we're going to look back on this period of time and try to understand and define what it meant for us. But one thing we're going to really understand is people appreciating, maybe, as Alicia said, the smaller things, being more aware of your surroundings, of your relationships, you know, the value of a small wedding as opposed to a big one. You know, I think we'll look back and really appreciate the beauty that came forward. You know, I love the stories of artists who now they couldn't, you know, do their musical on Broadway, so they're on Zoom, you know, with a wonderful production. So I think it's a reflection of our human nature that we have this creative ability and output, and to see it come out in all these different ways, we just need to celebrate that.
Thank you, Angela.
Anne needs to be unmuted.
Oh, really?
There we go. Thank you. I would totally agree just with, I think this, from my own life, this has actually not been a slower year. I call this year the Great Avalanche, but I'm very respectful of, I have many artist friends who have just really dug into the creative solitude of the year. But still, I think with the slowing down of social activity, and there has just been a appreciation for presence, for the small things, taking a walk, becoming a nurturer. I find myself cutting more flowers around than normal and rearranging them. I think recapturing some older art forms, I'm finding myself creating more care packages this year for people who are in hospitals, or just sort of the exchange of trying to tailor something that's unique to the person. And in my case, I think partly journalistically, I loved what everyone has said, but Rima, a lot of your comments just really were touching me as I think about sort of the cross-cultural beauty of this world and our lives. And my own life, which has been I grew up overseas and kind of lived in a variety of different class quadrants and in the US. And I think in the context of so much isolation this year, it's been really important for me to try to force myself into a practice of intentionally calling a few people on one hand who, you know, have a very different, you know, are in either very different vocation, but probably more acutely sort of economic, racial, sort of the demographics in which they live and serve and work. And I think just understanding both where people are suffering, who are far away from me geographically, as well as where they're finding beauty, those conversations as a practice when you can't automatically be, has been very enriching, and has, I think, kept me both hopeful and also just emotionally alive to the range of human experience of this year, which has been so diverse, of the pandemic specifically, but also of the variety of other crises. And there's somehow been beauty in that for me. So.
That's exceptional, Anne, finding ways to have human connection when we can't have it in the ways that we're traditionally used to having it, whether it's a cup of coffee, but finding ways to do that and reach out. That's beautiful. Rima, do you want to close us out?
I thank you again for facilitating this, and thank you to the other panelists. I've really enjoyed being here today. And I think as we head into the cold, dark, isolated days of winter, if we can all take some time to learn about the culture of others. I'm reminded of Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, you know, really trying not to laugh, and actually laughing when listening to Inuit Indigenous people participating in their beautiful throat singing, and how that's such an old tradition that they have, but because Prince Charles didn't understand their tradition and their culture, laughing while they're practicing and being vulnerable is really an injustice to these people. And I think that for each one of us, there's so much that we can learn from one another. There's so much that we can learn about different cultures and finding beauty and appreciating it, because that's what makes the world beautiful, is our differences. Mm-hmm. If we were all the same, the world wouldn't be this beautiful. And while we can have differences, while we may not agree on everything, there is something that, a thread that ties all of us together. And just appreciating others, taking time to understand others where they're at. Once we all come out of this isolation period, I think it will make the world more beautiful.
Thank you, Rima. That's an exquisite way to end this conversation. And thanks to each of you and to the panelists for reminding us of different ways we can find beauty in our everyday, and whether it's through human connection or just elevating a moment or elevating the senses. So thank you. And to all of our participants, thank you so much for joining us here. And I wish you guys all a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you again.